Welcome to another webinar sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Smart Policing Initiative. I'm Chip Coldren. I'm the Project Director at CNA for the Smart Policing Initiative, and this afternoon today I'm pleased to welcome and introduce Chuck Katz from Arizona State University and several of his colleagues who will present today's webinar on social network analysis and smart policing. I'll ask Chuck to begin and introduce his co-presenters in just a minute. I just need to mention a few things. If you notice the chat room, there was a message put up there about a reminder to have people who are not actively speaking to their systems on mute so we don't get interference. Thank you for that. Everybody should be mindful of the fact that we record these webinars so we can reproduce them later for others who cannot attend. So that's something to keep in mind as we participate today. We do have the chat function, which I'm sure you can see at the right hand of the screen. We encourage you to use that if you have questions or require clarifications during the presentation. And if you post something up there, you'll get a response in short order. And this presentation, this webinar, as I mentioned, will be available on the Smart Policing website soon after today for anybody who wants to revisit it or look at the recording. And I always remind everybody who's on the phone or participating that you'll receive a request for an evaluation of this webinar immediately after it concludes. And I encourage you to pay attention to that. It's not just a vehicle for checking on how the presentations are going, but it's a vehicle that we use to get input from participants and interested parties on what other types of webinars or technical assistance products we might be developing under the name of smart policing. So as always, I ask you to please pay attention to that and respond. As you noticed, today's webinar is on social network analysis, and I think you'll find this very interesting. It's kind of catching on in the world of policing and in the world of smart policing these days. So without further ado, please let me introduce Chuck Katz from Arizona State University.
Thank you, Chip, and thanks for having us, giving us today an opportunity to speak. My name is Charles Katz. I'm a professor of criminology at Arizona State University, as well as the director of Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety. Also speaking today will be Andrew Fox. He was a former student here at ASU working on his PhD. He recently graduated and is now a faculty member at University of Missouri, Kansas City. Mike White will also be joining us on some of the stop and thinks. Mike White has been taking the lead with Glendale on the SPI project there, in which I've been collaborating with him. And David Choate will also be joining us. He's been working with me on the Phoenix SPI project, as well as Mike on the Glendale project as a project manager. Today we wanted to talk a little bit about social network analysis and the role that it can play in intelligence-led policing. Intelligence-led policing, as Radcliffe has noted, is a managerial philosophy where data analysis, crime analysis are used to make decisions that help facilitate problem reduction, dealing with issues in the community, primarily focused on targeted offenders. When people talk about intelligence-led policing, they typically talk about four major components. One is making decisions strategically, followed by the second in terms of those decisions being made through intelligence or data that is collected in the field. This strategic decision-making is typically focused on reducing a problem or criminal events by targeting prolific offenders. If you take a look at the next slide, in terms of policing paradigms over the past several decades, we notice that community policing is on the upper left-hand side. Community policing has been an approach in which we look at problems more broadly, in which police agencies typically focus on criminal events. CompStat is a little bit lower on the problem focus scale, focus on problems a little bit more narrowly, but also focus on criminal events as well. Problem-oriented policing focuses narrowly on problems, but can focus both on events and offenders. And then more recently, over the past few years, more and more agencies have been focusing on intelligence-led policing. Intelligence-led policing typically focuses on very specific problems as well as focuses on specific offenders through the intelligence collected through a law enforcement agency. Intelligence-led policing typically uses the intelligence that law enforcement agencies gather to address criminal groups or prolific offenders. Oftentimes, this is done through understanding social relationships within these criminal groups or within offending or within individuals who offend and who they offend with. As a result, social network analysis has become increasingly popular within police agencies in the United States today. It's perhaps taken a little bit of a slow start, but it's beginning to pick up rapidly. Social network analysis is an analytical tool or a methodology that allows police agencies to map social relationships between one another. It can identify group or organizational characteristics, and most importantly, it can tell you who is at the center of these relationships. Andrew Fox is going to talk a little bit more about how this works a little in practice.
Yeah, before we get into some of the examples of using social network analysis with law enforcement agencies, first wanted to kind of establish some terminology that we'll be using. Most of the time, social network analysis comes along with some kind of graphic display that shows us the social structure of what we're examining. And what you see on the screen here is a small just example of what a social network analysis sociogram might look like. As you can see, the little green people could represent, these are your nodes. These are individuals. These could represent gangs or businesses or any unit that you're looking at identifying its relationship with other similar units. Additionally, you have connections between them. So if these were individuals, you could have either directed or undirected ties between those nodes. So you see between C and E, you have a directed tie where the sociogram is displaying that person C indicates a relationship with person E. We might see this in surveys of students where individuals are asked, who are your friends? And individual C could indicate that they're friends with E, but person E didn't reciprocate that friendship or indicate that they were also friends with C. And so you have a directed type of relationship. There's also undirected relationships, and a lot of time with law enforcement data, as you're going to see today, we have mostly undirected ties. These are also called edges. An undirected tie simply notes that we know that two individuals or two gangs have a relationship between each other or with each other, but there's no direction to that relationship, and so we have directed and undirected ties. Once we've created a network, the difficulty then is to start to identify who the important players are or who the most central individuals are or gangs are that might be in this network. Today, I'd just like to propose 3 different types of centrality, where these would be the definition of who's most important, who's most central to this network. The first type of centrality is called degree centrality. This is the most simplest form of centrality. It is the number of individuals a person is tied to. So the more connections you have, the higher degree centrality you have. That's kind of our most simple form of understanding who's most central. We know that this type of centrality does not indicate the most strategically placed individuals, but just those who have the most connections within a network. The second type is betweenness centrality. This type of centrality helps us to identify individuals who are more strategically placed within the network. The best way I like to describe this is if we looked at social networks as if they were a system of streets and intersections. each individual being an intersection and each street being a connection between those intersections. Betweenness centrality helps us identify those intersections that are the most well-traveled. So these are places within a network where the network tends to bottleneck and information or goods would have to flow through one individual to get to other parts of the network. Those with high betweenness centrality, as you'll see later on, are strategically placed. These individuals have to manage different sets of relationships in different clusters of the group, and so they're more difficult positions to fill. The third type we're covering today is eigenvector centrality. Eigenvector centrality really helps us to identify parts of the network that are really cohesive. So this defines those individuals who are connected to well-connected others. So it's not just who your friends are, but who your friends' friends are. And so we can use eigenvector centrality to identify very cohesive portions of the network. Social network analysis has been used
Andrew, it seems that we've lost the audio from your line.
If you'd like, I can just go ahead and pick up where Andrew was out if he's not on anymore until he gets back on.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah,
So, yeah, this is the slide that's up is an example of the 911 hijacker network. This was not using any fancy intelligence gathered by Department of Homeland Security after it was created. It was actually developed through a series of newspaper articles that came out, and a number of academics started to illustrate how social network analysis could be used for issues related to Homeland Security. And what you can see here is two individuals in the green box down in the lower half of the chart were at the center of the network. And what you can see is that all 19 terrorists were within 2 steps of the 2 original suspects identified in 2000. And it suggests that we don't have to go that far in terms of understanding the networks that individuals are involved in, or the number of steps out that an individual or who individuals have contact with to have a thorough understanding of social networks within a given community, criminal organization, or the such. Now, one of the things that people have been trying to focus on is whether or not social network analysis can be conducted using police data. A lot of people have had concerns about it, knowing what we know about police data, but there's also a lot of strengths. One is that police data is already collected. It does not require us to go out and collect any new data. We can use data or intelligence that's already been collected by a police agency, so this information is easily accessible. It's right there at police agencies' disposal. And also, the way police data is collected is it's well organized for social network analysis, largely that it's structured and relational as well as temporal in nature. If you think about police reports, field interrogation cards, or interview cards, they all typically contain places in which individuals who are the primary suspect, that information can be included, but also other individuals who are present at the situation, whether those are witnesses, victims, or other suspects in an event. However, we do recognize that there are a number of weaknesses with police data. One is incompleteness. Oftentimes, forms are not filled out. We have missing fields in which officers do not complete the information. This can be either because they forget to or more likely because they simply don't have that information. We can also have inaccuracies. Keep in mind a lot of data that is collected in the field by the police is not necessarily confirmed. Individuals who are stopped do not always have an identification card with them, and so it can lead to inaccurate data collection. And then we can also have some inconsistencies in the identification of persons. Sometimes a person might identify an individual with one name, and another time another officers may identify an individual who is using another name or multiple aliases. Now, one of the advantages...
You able to hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, sorry about that. A couple of the advantages to the technique that you'll be seeing today. First off, police officers can generally and have for a long time connected information. This becomes a problem when there's large amounts of information and it becomes more difficult to organize it and to know where someone would be placed in a network. And so one of the biggest advantages is layout optimization. The software we're using is able to organize the information, the connections, and the relationships that we've identified through different systems and make sure that we have a clear layout of the information, that no lines are on top of each other. And essentially what we want to happen, just like when you look at a map, you expect that two cities are going to be, the distance between those cities on the map is going to equate to their physical distance from each other. We want the same to be true within the social network maps that we develop. The distance between two individuals on a page should be equal to their social distance within this network. And so we can optimize the layout in that way. Second, as you've seen, identifying those with high centrality, no matter what type of centrality we choose to use, but we can identify those who are most central to this network. And the third, and I think one of the more important ways, especially when working with law enforcement, is that the strategy we're going to present or that we've used in some of these examples is free. We use free software, mostly PyEC and Excel, to build these networks. And so it doesn't require a lot of startup costs, just the ability to train individuals in how to use it. And we'll mention some other packages that could be used as well.
Okay, this is Mike White. I think at this point it's useful to stop and to talk a little bit about the types of data or the types of intelligence that are available to use in this kind of analysis. And as Chuck Katz indicated, the good news here is that police departments are very, very good at collecting data. They routinely collect a ton of data. And even better news is that much of the data that's collected by police departments is ideal for capturing these types of social relationships. So the question then is that if you want to engage in this kind of analysis, what types of data should you focus on? And you'll see here on this slide a list of different types of data sources that can be used for social network analysis. At the top of the list, arrest data, crime report data, criminal history information. Obviously, that's going to be a good source because, after all, we're engaged in this kind of analysis because we're focused on criminal offending. The downside with arrest data, for example, though, is it really only captures a small slice of police contacts with individuals. So you can see some other data listed there. And for example, in Glendale, we've gone beyond just the arrest and criminal history information, and we've built in the use of field interview FI cards, gimmicks, which are it's a form that's completed by officers to capture gang affiliation as well as investigative leads. These types of data sources are ideal because one, they're much more common. So police officers can capture a greater universe of interactions with citizens. And second is that many of these forms are designed specifically to capture information on multiple individuals who are contacted by the police at the same time. and you can see there are other sources listed here. I'll give you one other example further down the list. You see jail and correctional visits. We'll talk in a little bit about the Glendale work that's been done with social network analysis, but just to jump ahead, one of the individuals that was identified as being central to the Glendale network was incarcerated. He was in county jail, and he was set to be released in the next few weeks. So what the Glendale officers did is they contacted the jail and correctional intel folks and started to gather some of the information from the intel at jail on who was visiting this individual, the types of contacts he was having with who, phone calls, and those types of things. So and I think a little further on we'll hear from Dave Choate on some of the kind of the nuts and bolts of collecting this information. But I did want to turn it over and just ask a question of some of the attendees who are on the webinar. Outside of the types of information that you see on this slide, are there other data sources or sources of intelligence that you think could be useful for this type of analysis? Okay, one other suggestion then to at least get you thinking about other data sources. In Glendale, one of the other sources of intelligence we began with but soon discarded was victim and witness contact data. That is, individuals who were identified in arrest reports, in DRs, department reports, but not as suspects or investigative leads, individuals that were identified as a witness or as a victim. And we included that information, and then for a variety of reasons, the officers in discussions with the research partners, we decided to exclude that information.
Hi, this is Chips. I was just thinking that you don't have arrest reports listed, and many times on the arrest reports it says other people arrested with the arrestee, and there's like 4 or 5 boxes on them. And I think that ought to be added. I like your FI cards. I'm not sure how you get court transcripts and into a database you can use. So I'm a little confused about that, but I really like the other opportunity that you've talked about, and that is the arrest sheet is good.
Yeah, Chips, this is Chuck Katz. Yeah, one of the innovative strategies that's being used in Europe right now by analysts who are examining criminal organizations, particularly in Italy, is going back through old court transcripts from within that nation and coding them in terms of who was working with who and how. Oftentimes, information that has not been put into place by the police gets revealed in court that was previously unrecorded, and they're taking that information to develop a broader understanding of organized crime in Italy, for example. As a result, some folks have been trying to mimic that and looking at biker gangs and taking court information there and looking at social information or social relationships revealed through court transcripts and the such to get a better idea of organized crime groups here.
I think that's a good idea. I understand how it kind of works now, but it seems more effective might be if you could somehow tap into the detectives who are supposed to debrief everybody that's arrested regarding other crimes and other people and what their relationships are. I don't think that information ever surfaces, but it ought to, because it's usually in the detective's notebook. But that would be an important source of information that you could use.
Sure.
I think I understand the court transcript a bit. It just seems to be really labor intensive for your average, criminal enterprise.
It is.
That most local police deal with. That's all I was saying. Good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is Chuck Katz again. What we were going to talk about next was a little bit about the Glendale Police Department pilot study. I'm working with Mike White on SPI in Glendale, and one of the strategies that we're focusing on is intelligence-led policing through social network analysis. But before we started that project, we tried to take conduct a pilot study to even see if it was possible to use police data. And we wanted to start off, I guess, a little bit more of a simple approach in looking at relational data from 2006 through 2010, looking at gang data. In particular, in Arizona, police agencies collect gang member identification cards, which document individuals within particular communities. And we brought that data together with FI card data, as well as merging that data with criminal history data. That project ended up turning into Andrew Fox's dissertation, so we'll have him talk about that next.
Yeah, so some of the major findings from this study, we found that the intelligence that was collected was fairly reliable, and we were able to consistently construct networks over the 5-year period. One of the things that we found it was, given the structure of the data and identifying individuals across different reports, making sure we had the same Andrew Fox or whoever it was in different reports, it made the process of collecting the data and compiling it very time-consuming. In this initial project, it took us somewhere between 6 and 8 months to collect all the data and develop a systematic way to do so. And so the data management systems that we were working with were not really optimal for collecting relational data. But we did find that social network analysis and kind of harvesting this data from the systems, there can be some very strong utility in terms of understanding the social structures and potentially intervening in those social structures. Some of the major findings from that analysis, first we found that when we looked at the social interactions and the data that from FIs, we found that there wasn't one large cohesive gang, but instead there were many smaller connected groups of individuals who tended to hang out together. This provides some good information in terms of what types of interventions might work given the size of the social group. Something else very important that we found that really makes us question what exactly is a group or a gang is that gang members from different cliques were often found in the same network, social network. We found the same thing here in Kansas City, that individuals from different gangs, when you look at their social structure, they're often found to be hanging out in the same group of individuals. We call these hybrid gangs, where you have groups of individuals from different gangs all associating with each other. And those gangs that were, or those groups that we could consider hybrid gangs, tended to be the most criminally involved. Additionally, applying the different types of centrality, so using 4 different types of centrality in this study, we found that betweenness centrality was the most important, and those with high betweenness centrality were more likely to be criminal involved in the year that that network was constructed. And so using that measure of centrality helped us to identify some very important players within the group. To build on that, individuals who had high betweenness centrality and were gang members were the most likely in the networks to be criminally involved. What you see here is an example of what I was talking about in terms of hybrid gangs. And so you see here the sociogram of the gang network in 2007. You have different connected components. Each dot is an individual, and each line between them is a connection based on FI cards that were collected. The color of the dots, or the color of the nodes, indicate which clique they were in. And so you can see that in the top left, the largest component, you have individuals from all 3 different cliques all hanging out together. And this really helps us understand the social structure of the group, not just that they're in 3 different named gangs, but we now know that they all hang out together. This type of information has really helped us understand some of the dynamics here in Kansas City. I would suggest that the fact that all of these different gangs are hanging out socially in close connection is the reason for a lot of the rivalry and violence that might take place within them. There's been a lot of talk about geography and hotspot policing, and these 2 ideas can go really well together. Here you see everyone in that network mapped geographically of where they live. The size of the dot that you see corresponds to their betweenness centrality. And you can see that most of them, while they're socially connected, likely because they all come from the same neighborhoods. And you can see that we could easily approach this as identifying hot individuals within hot spots. And so the 2 geography and social networks really can build off each other very well. Looking at those with top between centrality, you can see that they should be of some interest to us when we're looking at these criminal groups. About halfway down here, you see that those with high betweenness centrality were more likely to be gang members. In terms of criminal behavior, they're also significantly more likely to be arrested for a violent arrest and more likely to be arrested overall. And so betweenness centrality is really helping us identify where to focus resources within a social network of individuals.
Okay. Next, after we worked with Glendale on a pilot project, we started to spin this off into one was the SPI project in Glendale, as well as started to collaborate with Phoenix PD on trying to demonstrate the utility of social network analysis. And this, what we did was just sort of a basic proof of concept to once again see if it would work in Phoenix. This was called Operation Jenga by the folks there. And what the chief and the intelligence folks there were interested in was how hard is it to get to the data? Does it produce information about relationships that we wouldn't otherwise see? Does it allow us to understand subgroups that we wouldn't otherwise identify in trying to understand what the structure of the network looks like? And does it help us differentiate or understand the roles that members play within certain networks? And so what we started off with in a basic project was one individual named Annabelle who was recommended by several detectives as a problematic or potentially problematic individual. This is an individual who was suspected of money laundering, had been kidnapped twice, in which the payoff was $1 million each time. Her ex-husband was a cartel member in Mexico. She owned a check cashing business, and a tax service, a notary business, which was thought to perhaps facilitate criminal activity. And so what we did was, starting Annabella as the center, we moved out in trying to identify her social network through field interview cards, departmental reports. We did only use Phoenix PD data, but we went back 3 years and went back 2 steps, as we've discussed in the past. And right here is what you can see what the social network looks like. You can see that one lead in looking at their networks through official police data, it resulted in the identification of about 320 people who have contact with Annabella, at least out through 2 steps. Some of these were family members of Annabella. Some of them were not. What was really interesting about this was that it identified individuals that were previously not really noticed by the police department. Here you can see the size of the dot is their betweenness centrality score. So the larger the dot, the more individuals whom they were connected with and information flowed to them. And what you see is that this network was fairly centralized, but yet fragmented, with different individuals playing a role in connecting some subgroups to other subgroups. Now, what we learned from this exercise was that we can use police data in Phoenix to engage in social network analysis. We found, though, that it was a very labor-intensive process. It took quite a bit of time, but it ended up being very valuable to the detectives there. Like I said before, one lead resulted in about 320 relationships after 2 steps, but what was even more important was that we saw those 2 largest dots, or these 2 people, reach about 50% of the social network that surrounds Annabella. And we found that the key players in this social network were not necessarily the most criminally involved, or those individuals that the police department had the most intelligence on. So it gave them actionable intelligence. But we did learn that there were several challenges in using police data. One was it was very labor intensive. We had to manually look up individuals, we had to verify that information on a person-by-person basis, and we had to manually build edge lists to construct our database. In Phoenix, our CAD RMS system does not necessarily have a reliable identification code in which we can look up information. As a result, we were more likely to find errors. Now, this issue is being addressed by a new CAD RMS system that's that's going to be implemented, but at the current time it was quite a bit of time to ensure that our data was quality. And it's a manual process which takes time, so it reduced our ability to use it in a tactical manner. In other words, we couldn't necessarily start a project from point A and get to point B in one day. It was going to take a little bit of time to get the network established and then move on from there in a more tactically oriented approach. But the question that was asked is, how can we use this information, whether it be in Phoenix or whether it be in Glendale, to help us make decisions or strategically approach offender groups? For example, if we want to use degree centrality or the number of ties a node has in the network, these might not be the most strategic targets, but they might be important information in who we want to include information from. For example, we may want to approach them in looking for an informant, or we may want to pick them up to engage in a free talk. Because they have a number of contacts in the network, they may be valuable as an informal source of information, or maybe even a formal source of information. If we're using Betweenness centrality, or those that are intersection of many paths between others, these might be really strategic targets for disrupting the network. We might be able to take these individuals out through arrest or some other enforcement activity that might be able to send a strong deterrent message. Or what we might be able to do is call in some of these individuals, share a message with them that we want directed out to those individuals who they have contact with. And then, of course, we have eigenvector centrality, in which these individuals are connected to other connected individuals. These people might be appropriate for a pulling levers strategy, as has been done in Boston and other places, in which we could engage in some collective accountability strategies. So in Glendale, how we used this information was we went with a strategy that used Betweenness centrality to try to strategically locate individuals of importance to try to disrupt networks. So what we did was we identified the top 10 individuals. In this case, this was a violent network identified in the southern part of Glendale, and we came up with the top 10 the top 10 individuals who had the highest Betweenness centrality scores, and started to create intelligence sheets on them. You can see here with Jane Doe, she was a Hispanic Latina. She actually lived in, or she had parents who lived in Phoenix. They were stable. They had been located at that location for a while. She was unemployed, but she had had a series of departmental reports in Glendale on a number of issues related to violence as well as drug use. And then on these intelligence sheets, we also included the individual's social networks. And you can see here down the left-hand side of the screen that we have a number of this person's associates listed and their departmental reports, so that officers would have a strong idea of who they had contact with in the community And then on the first page, which I skipped over, you can also see that it has the location where they live.
Okay,
Mike?
this is Mike White again. At this point, we'd like to just take a minute and stop and talk about what we should do with these data. And Chuck was just getting into this. Basically, this question involves responses. Once you have this information, then what? And I'll provide just a little bit more detail on how things have progressed in Glendale and talk about some of the responses. But then I'd like to hear some comments from the attendees regarding what they think are other potential responses. So in Glendale, what we did is we have a couple of different social network projects going on. I'm going to describe one that involves property offenders. So the commander in the one division identified a large hotspot, and it included several grids. It was fairly large. And then what we did is we asked the officers working on SPI to self-nominate about 15 known property offenders who lived in that particular hotspot or are known to offend in that hotspot. And the officers did that. They identified 15 or so. And then what we did is we built the social network around those 15 individuals in the process that has been described earlier. And as we did that, we ended up building a network that included more than 200 individuals. And then what we did is we simply ranked the individuals in the network based on Betweenness centrality. And by doing that, we were able to identify the top 15 or 20 offenders in terms of their connectivity in the network. And then at that point, what we did is the lieutenant essentially assigned each officer one of those top 15 or so offenders. And then the officer had that person. Their job was then to go out, find that person, and deliver the response. But that then raises the issue of what should the response be. And there are a couple of different responses that we've used in Glendale, and there are a couple that we're in planning stages with. One obvious response is arrest. There have been a number of cases where people have emerged as being central to the network, and these are individuals who have open felony warrants. So we call these individuals low-hanging fruit. That particular officer then, his or her job is simply to go out, find the person, and make an arrest. We've also used an informal version of pulling levers, and that is officers they find their person and they deliver a message. And it's a very simple message that is, we know who you are, we know that you've offended in the past, and we know you're active in offending right now. We're watching you. If you keep it up, we're going to make an arrest. If you need help, we can help you. We can help you with getting help through a variety of resources. The lieutenant who's been working on this developed or came up with a term that we really like, and it's positive paranoia. That is, you want to create this sense among the individuals in the network that they're on the radar screen. And one of the really useful things that can be done with social networks is that you can deliver that message to one person. But when you deliver that message to the people who are most connected to the network, that message then can be diffused out as they communicate with other people in the network. So those are two responses that we've used. A couple others that we're planning to use. Obviously, some of these individuals can be very useful as confidential informants. That's something we've talked about. And we've also talked about simple surveillance. That is, some of these people, if you just follow them around for a day or two, you're going to get a lot of really useful, valuable intelligence on what's going on. I think at this point, I'll open it up and ask if any attendees have any other thoughts about potential responses that are viable.
Mike, this is Chips again.
Okay, Chips, go ahead.
Hello? Oh, good. Yeah, what would I like to use this for in my community? There are two things that you haven't talked about, but you sort of talked around it. The first one is that it looks a lot like phishing to me, as opposed to starting with a key contact or a key node, and then dissecting that person's network to find out how that person is related to others that we might not know about. And maybe that's what you're doing, but it wasn't clear to me. And the other issue I wanted to bring up was, is it possible, and I don't know what the search and seizure law looks like, but say, for instance, that you have a guy that you've arrested. Can you essentially download his address book and use that as a source to start the node analysis off of his cell phone? And my third question is, what about this idea of burn phones, and how big a problem have you guys found that in Glendale and other places where they basically use a phone for 30 days and toss it away? Thanks.
I can respond to at least the first of those issues that you raised, Chips, and that involves whether it's phishing or whether it can be something a little more directed. And just a couple of different examples. What we did is, once we produced a list of kind of ranked offenders on Betweenness Centrality, we have a big meeting with the officers, and then we go through the list kind of person by person and pull all the information we have on that person and just have a kind of a collective debrief about who this individual is. And there have been a couple of times where officers have seen names on the list that are a little further down, and it's someone they know, it's someone they're concerned about, and they say, you know what, I'm going to, if you give me number 28 on the list, I know I can go find that person right away, and I can deliver the response right away because I know where he is, I've had a recent contact with him, and I've got suspicions about what he's up to. So that's one example where it can be a little more directed. A second example, it so happened that one of the officers was reviewing all of the people who had been identified as top 15 in terms of Betweenness Centrality. And that officer realized that nearly all of those people had had a recent contact with the Glendale Police Department at one of two locations, either a Motel 6 or a small apartment complex. And as we began to take a closer look at that officer was absolutely correct. And so one of the things we've done now is we've kind of rebuilt in the place-based component. So we went from a large kind of amorphous hotspot to focusing on a small number of, to use Andrew's term, hot people. And now we're back to looking at hot people at two very small micro hotspots. And with that Motel 6, for example, the officers are doing saturation patrols at that motel, working closely now with the motel manager. In fact, the motel manager has agreed to basically, every morning send over the list of all guests who have checked in so that the officers then can run their names and things like that. So those are a couple examples of responses. And one other thing I might add, Kansas City has done this quite a bit, and maybe Andrew can talk about this either now or a little bit later, doing offender call-in, so doing kind of the full-blown pulling levers approach with people who have been identified through the social network analysis.
Yeah, this is Chuck, and as a way of sort of keeping it moving also is to answer Chip's question related to telephones. Yeah, police officers have been using link analysis now for quite a while in taking telephone data, whether it's getting the data from the telephone company or taking data off of cell phones that are obtained and using that information to build an idea of what the relationships look like for that individual. What's unique about network analysis is, though, that we can look at the importance of somebody, not just by whether somebody made a call, but we can also look at how often they called the individual, how long they were on the phone with the individual, to get a better idea of the type of relationship that the person has with them. In terms of burn phones, you're right. There's a definite disadvantage in that if that we have offenders who are moving through phones on a rapid pace. That strategy for collecting information is going to be relatively limited compared to others. But what I would like to add is that network analysis is really in its infancy. There's only a handful of communities that are using it now. I think it's sort of where crime mapping was at 20 years ago. I think that there's a lot of room for growth here, and I think that network analysis in another 10 years is going to be where GIS work is at today. I think it's going to become a real important part of a police agency's toolbox and trying to identify problem people and issues in their community. Andrew, do we want to go ahead and move on to the how network analysis is being used to respond to problems in Kansas City?
Yeah, sure. So in Kansas City, a project called the Kansas City No Violence Alliance has developed as a partnership between state, local, federal prosecutors, local police, ATF, the city, now the FBI, and the university to implement a focused deterrence strategy. This focused deterrence strategy is being fed by social networks that are being developed of known offenders within the city. As the first project, kind of the one of the first networks that were built, we can go to the next slide. We identified a small gang in part of the city to kind of develop our network building strategies, and this was you're seeing a picture of the first network that was identified. After this network was built, individuals were identified who were most central, and shortly after we did that, two of the individuals with high Betweenness centrality ended up conducting a drive-by and killing a few individuals, and the partners all decided we're going to put together an enforcement strategy for this network to see if we can stop some of this violence. Within that network, the component you saw was about 202 individuals. 60 of them were on probation parole, 32 had pending cases, 126 had active warrants, and 22 had felony warrants. And so you can see there's a lot of different avenues in terms of hooks that we had on these individuals. Further, when we identify their Betweenness centrality, you can see if we layer in that information, those with high Betweenness centrality are also individuals who are commonly wanted. They're involved in this organization or this network of individuals who are engaged in crime, and our important players were also wanted. And so it made it pretty easy to design a strategy to intervene in this group. This was kind of a demonstration project, and so we didn't use other types of methods, but just an enforcement strategy was engaged in this group. And to note that a big part, we had a lot of violence right before this took place, about 13 homicides in the month of January, and after this enforcement took place, things went very quiet because it wasn't a typical enforcement strategy or sweep where they just take the low-hanging fruit. They conducted it in a network of individuals. So everyone in this network got some kind of visit from a team of law enforcement officers, and they were able to shut down violence within that network for a period of time. The full implementation of focused deterrence, you could start to identify who you want to have at Collins, but also other medicines instead of just arrest and prosecution. Developing a strategy where individuals on the fringe of the network might get social services or an offer of services, and also engaging the community to help influence those individuals who are important to the network. These are all different things we're trying. In terms of training, this is really a key element of the success we've seen in terms of building social networks here in Kansas City. As we've seen in Glendale and Phoenix, it's been a very time-consuming effort to build networks. One of the things we've learned here in Kansas City is that their RMS systems had unique identifier numbers for individuals, which has allowed us to make networks within a few days of individuals we might be concerned with. And so in terms of training crime analysts, I think the right place for this analysis is to have crime analysts that are able to create social networks is finding the right crime analysts. Finding those who understand the data systems within the police department and that understand how to manipulate large amounts of data. The second part is giving those analysts time and space to operate and to understand the concepts behind social network analysis, not just the directive of conducting a social network analysis, but them understanding the concepts because issues come up and how to manipulate the networks as more information is learned. This is important to allow them some time to figure it out. I think it's very possible and it is very beneficial for agencies to train crime analysts in this. As I said, in Kansas City, there's 2 individuals who are dedicated to building social networks, and their requests have been coming in from all directions. Now they will build a social network after every homicide. They will take the suspects and victims as the starting point and then build steps out from those individuals. Investigators get a social network of the individuals involved at the beginning of their investigation, which looks to be very useful as they investigate those crimes. In terms of software, just to mention very briefly, everything you've seen today, we've been using PIEC, which is a free download, and it's just a matter of learning to use that application. There's also UCINet that certain departments have used. I know you can get a free download for 6 months, and then it's a small fee. It's not an expensive software. There are also some resource manuals out there. PIEC has a book, a training manual that can take you through with data and examples to help you learn how to use it. There's also a couple of different training seminars. I know UCINet has an annual training seminar. But also a local university. Most universities have someone now that is engaging in social network analysis across very different fields, but the techniques are generally the same. And also CNA having resources to help connect different sites with others who are doing social network analysis.
Thanks, Andrew. That was what we were primarily intending to present. We were hoping to answer any questions that folks might have next.
Hey, Chuck, this is Chip Coldren.
Yeah.
A couple things. First, I'd just like to know if anybody on the line who's participating or listening in is actually actively using social network analysis in any way at this point in time, or if they're mostly interested and curious about it, and if it's the latter, or even the former, to indicate on your evaluation forms if you think some kind of a follow-up to this webinar would be desired in terms of looking in more in-depth at how to take these various data sources and make them useful for social network analysis, maybe looking at some other case studies. So I'm curious about that. I wonder if you wouldn't mind, Chuck, going back to slide 13 for a minute. Can you backtrack?
Sure.
So this was one of the most interesting slides to me, and the one that Andrew called our attention to on the left-hand side there, that shows how there are multiple gangs that are interacting with each other. So I'm just wondering, I understand that each of the dots and the lines are showing connectedness between gangs, and Andrew kind of talked about it in terms of these gangs hanging out together. And so I've got a specific question and a more general question. How do you come to understand what is the actual nature of these links? And I'm not sure if they're kind of hanging out together physically on the street. Maybe they're just in touch with each other in some way. But how do you get to the really in-depth kind of granular information about what these relationships are, other than the connectedness that you get from the data analysis? So it's kind of a more qualitative approach to understanding these networks, and I'm particularly interested in what these particular relationships in this hybrid network like. So I guess that's my question.
Andrew, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So all the connections you see here are based on field interview forms, and so we know that the individuals were together at a specific time in a specific place. And so the nature of the relationship really at this level, given this study, was just we know that they were hanging out together, and an officer filled out an FIF. I can speak a little bit more about it from I've seen something very identical here in Kansas City. One of the important aspects of using official data is going to be validating those networks. And what I mean by that is then taking these networks, in the last few weeks, what we've been doing is we use the official data, whether it's co-arrest or FI cards, to build the network, but then taking it out to street officers who have been interacting with these individuals on a daily basis, and having them just tell you what the nature of these relationships are and the dynamics within these networks. And it's been tremendously helpful in terms of understanding how all these people know each other. Are we missing certain individuals or relationships? Have some individuals moved on, or whatever the case may be? And understanding, one of the aspects, say, for example, this network you see in the top left that you pointed out, we saw something similar in Kansas City, and the little offshoot that you see coming out from the bottom left was generally individuals who were homeless and using drugs. And the core group were a gang who was selling drugs. And so you start to get individuals connected through drug sales that might not be a part of that gang. And so it was really helpful to understand the nature of this network beyond just what the official data told us.
Right.
And so I think those two strategies are important.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Jeff, this is Mike. I can respond to the your comment about a more qualitative look. Chuck, I don't know what slides they are, but if you could go to the slides that have the Glendale Intel sheet.
Sure.
One of the things we do when we identify people who are of interest, who are central to the network, we sit down with the officers and we create these Intel sheets, and the sheets include the list of all of the recent DRs, or all the recent criminal activity. And what we can do, what we've done with the officers in the group, is we sit in a big conference room that has computer access to all their data sources. And for this particular person, this Jane Doe, for example, we can pull up each individual arrest report or DR and look at that case and see what the connection is between this person and someone else. What type of crime was it? Were they a suspect? Were they arrested? Those types of things. And so for each individual person, we can kind of build that more qualitative snapshot of the activity that they're involved in, as well as what the actual connections are to people in the network.
Very good, Mike. Thank you. Appreciate it. So I think we're a bit over time here. I want to wrap up in the next few minutes and just encourage, for those of you that are still on that have questions or have an interest in this topic, please contact Chuck Katz or Mike White, or send us a note at SPI@cna.org, and we'll be happy to respond. And as I indicated, we're going to consider maybe putting on a follow-up webinar to this one, depending on what we hear from participants. Let me just say, again, Chuck and Mike and David from ASU and Andrew for preparing and putting together this class. I find it very interesting. I think a number of other people did too. And as Chuck suggested, this is probably an interest area that's going to grow tremendously over the next couple of years in law enforcement and intelligence-led policing. So very much appreciate the effort put into this. I always like to give a nod to our folks at CNA and our other SMEs, Vivian Elliott and Zoe Thorkelson, Chips and Hildy Sizo, Mike White as well, who work on this webinar series over the months and have really helped put together a great series. So thank everybody for that. I want to remind you to just keep your eyes open. There's a couple classes coming up. John Eck is going to do a webinar on place-based policing in the upcoming months. Scott Decker is going to redo his class on offender focus strategies. We have one coming up in January from Chief Davis in East Palo Alto on being a smart police chief, and another one planned for later that month on restorative justice and smart policing. So everybody, thank you again. I appreciate the participation. I appreciate the effort. I thought it was a great class. Take care, everybody.